Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. We're joined now by Jamil Jaffer, who's the founder of the National Security Institute at the George Mason University School of Law, and also served as the former senior counsel on the House Intelligence Committee. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Kimberly.
You're here to talk about FISA, but I want to take the opportunity of having you here to get your reaction on this breaking news overnight, these strikes in Israel.
Well, obviously an unprecedented attack, the first time that Iran has directly struck Israel from its own territory. They've been doing it for 2 decades with using proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the like. So obviously a surprising thing coming in response in part to the earlier Israeli strike in Damascus against a consulate that took out a senior leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, the leader of their Lebanon Corps. So the question really now is, obviously, the Israelis were able to take down with U.S. support a lot of these missiles and drones. So now the question is, what's going to happen next? Right? Will the Israelis feel the need to respond? There weren't a lot of casualties. There was an injury or two, as far as I can tell. But it was a significant strike, and had it not been stopped by the defensive systems, it could have been very deadly. And so the question is, will the Israelis feel the need to push back? And if so, what does that look like? Does that create a larger confrontation? And does the U.S. get involved?
It seems pretty clear the Biden administration is trying to de-escalate the situation, looking for a diplomatic solution, as a statement from the president said, meeting with the G7 today. What do you think is the likelihood that there's a diplomatic next step as opposed to a military one?
Yeah, it's hard to see what a diplomatic solution looks like. The Biden administration has sought repeatedly to find diplomatic solutions to these challenges, the Iran nuclear deal and the like, and they seem to actually make things worse. They seem to actually get things to the place where things are more tense because the other side, the Iranians, don't know where our red lines are and don't know where they need to stop, and so they test our boundaries. And so that's one of the challenges I think we found here. I think it's going to be hard to see. The real question is, what do the Israelis feel? What the Biden administration wants to do or not really doesn't matter here, because at the end of the day, the Israelis will decide whether to respond or not. They do listen to the United States. They do pay attention. We provide them a lot of their weaponry and the like, so they feel the need to pay attention. At the same time, 200 missiles and drones over your territory that if you hadn't stopped them could have killed tens of thousands. That's the kind of thing that gets you, frustrated. And a terrorist attack that kills, it's the equivalent of a dozen 9/11s. That's the kind of thing that can cause real unhappiness, as we've seen. And so the question becomes, how effective can the administration be? They've been effective, by the way, with the Israelis and this the potential attack against Rafah. The Israelis haven't conducted that attack, even though Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying for weeks that he wanted to move in there. So maybe they will be effective, try to calm the tensions down and see if they can find a path forward. But a lot of this is on the Iranians, right? They started this fight in a lot of ways, been funding Hezbollah and Hamas for decades, and now shot 200 missiles and drones over to Israel from their own territory.
Yeah, I think the latest numbers I saw that there were more than 300, actually. This attack, though, was quite well telegraphed by the Biden administration, saying it was coming a couple of days ago, obviously fueled by our intelligence network, yes, which is very related to the vote on Friday where the House reauthorized FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was set to expire this coming Friday, unless Congress finishes the vote to extend it. Can you remind us about this program and why the program was put in place in the first place?
Sure. So the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act generally was put into place in the late 1970s, early 80s to help protect Americans against government surveillance. This was in the aftermath of disclosures about government surveillance in the United States against Americans. That caused a lot of unhappiness in Congress. And so Congress passed a law to regulate that and to protect Americans and to give them more rights under U.S. law. After 9/11, there was a realization that law, which was written based on the then current technology in the late 70s, needed to be updated, needed to provide authorities for the government to surveil foreigners located outside the United States, but here in the United States with the help of U.S. telecommunications providers. So in about 2007, Congress passed a new law, part of FISA, but its own section 702, that allows the U.S. government, with the cooperation of U.S. providers, to surveil foreigners located overseas, not Americans. In fact, it actually protects Americans even better, because it says if you're an American overseas, you also get the right to a court order like you used to have under the old FISA law if you were in the United States. So this law is now up for reauthorization. It's up every 5 years or so for reauthorization. And the question before Congress is, will they reauthorize it before this deadline? your callers might be wondering, why am I hearing about this again? I just heard about this in December. What's going on? And the reason why is Congress hasn't been able to come to a consensus on how to do this, so they've been doing short-term extensions. The big issue in play, and we can talk more about it, is will Congress reauthorize this law now? If they don't, what will happen? How bad will that be? And if they do reauthorize it, what kind of protections or additional protections they want in place? Because there have been some debates about traditional FISA and this new Section 702, and sometimes people confuse them like the former president.
Let's actually talk a bit more about Section 702. We've got a little graphic here talking about what exactly is in this. It allows intelligence agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance of non-citizens based outside the U.S. Some U.S. communications can appear in collections if Americans are talking with non-U.S. citizens overseas, and that data collected is stored for years in a searchable database that intelligence agencies can tap as part of other investigations. And that's a summary from Axios.
Yeah.
How effective has Section 702 been, in your opinion?
Section 702 is probably the most important single intelligence collection program the U.S. government runs, period, full stop. It provides information that goes into about more than half the president's daily brief every single day. So what we collect through Section 702 are phone calls, emails, and the like of foreigners located outside the United States, spies and terrorists, right? These are non-Americans. And the way we do that is we work with U.S. telecommunications providers to provide them the email addresses, the phone numbers, and then they give us that data under the oversight of a court. Now, the reason why it's warrantless is because foreigners located outside the United States don't have any rights under our Constitution. They don't have a right to a warrant. And in fact, you couldn't even get a warrant to surveil them. There's no warrant authority to collect against a foreigner located outside the United States. It's not a thing. So as a result, we conduct the surveillance. Now, you're right. The big controversy as well, but you're picking up Americans who are talking to these foreigners. Well, that's true of any kind of surveillance, right? Even a warrant-based surveillance. If I have a warrant on you, you call me, they're going to get my voice as well, right? Because that's how the system works. So the question then becomes, how do you protect that? How do you minimize that? And if you are going to collect on that American who does have rights and does have a right to a court order, how do you do that? And under the law, the government's required to go get a court order to conduct that surveillance of an American if they're targeting that American. The big concern everyone has as well, you're still getting their voice. You're still getting their emails. You have their content. You want to search this database of foreign intelligence information for their email addresses. That should require a warrant, and that's the big fight on Capitol Hill right now.
And that fight failed in the House on Friday when they attempted to add an amendment to that effect. And as the New York Times reported, the House ended up passing a 2-year extension instead of that normal 5-year extension. And I wonder your reaction to that and how what the House passed squares with what the Senate has passed, because you mentioned earlier there's a struggle to reach a consensus.
Well, what's interesting is the Senate hasn't yet acted. It's kind of surprising because normally in these situations, particularly as we're getting really close to an expiration, both houses are trying to move legislation, and there may be differences in the bills. The Senate hasn't acted yet, so they're going to have to take up this House bill in the next week and pass it. If they amend it and send it back, there's a very real possibility the law will expire on the 19th. And the problem with expiration is that even though the U.S. government may have authorities going on for another year during this transition period, a lot of communications providers have made clear they will not cooperate with new requests for surveillance if the law itself is expired, even if the government has existing authorities in place under transition procedures. So that's a huge gap, particularly as we see these wars that are happening in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, a war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, increased terrorist threats. We just saw ISIS bomb a theater in Moscow, right? I mean, this is a real scary situation the world is in. And let's not even forget about China and potentially Taiwan. And so we need these authorities. And the idea that the Senate might let this expire, or that the House was so close. I mean, that vote on warrants was tight. It was 212 to 212. It failed because it didn't, but it was one vote apart, right? And the Biden administration was very clear about this. They're completely opposed to a warrant requirement. And that could have tanked the bill altogether. So what the Senate needs to do now is they need to act fast, and they need to, if they're going to vote on a warrant requirement, that's fine. That's what the Senate does. The House did it. But they need to defeat that warrant requirement as well, because that would make it very difficult for the U.S. government to do the kind of surveillance it needs. I mean, right at the time when an American might be talking to a foreign terrorist or spy, right when you want to know that, the government will be told, nope, you got to go put that file in a drawer and go ask a federal judge for permission, even though that file you have, that information, was lawfully collected.
So that warrant requirement really was controversial in the House, and Republican Thomas Massie actually ended up voting no on the final passage of the FISA bill and was the main proponent of that warrant requirement. Here he is on the House floor earlier this week.
Today we're voting on a resolution that will bring forward reauthorization of a program that's been abused for decades, the FISA 702 surveillance program. Before we vote on that program, though, this resolution that we're voting on now prescribes that we will bring forward an amendment to require warrants if you want to spy on Americans, if you want to use this database as a backdoor to look at the privacy, the private information of Americans, you would need a warrant if this amendment passes. Now, there's some people who say, oh, getting a warrant is too hard. It'll slow us down. You'll put America in danger. Listen, I've been in the SCIF, the classified area where they're supposed to tell us the problems with requiring a warrant, and they never have told us a single example of where getting a warrant would be a problem to national security. In fact, we've got a provision in the warrant amendment that says in exigent circumstances, you can skip that step. You'll hear today that, oh, everything's fine. We don't need the warrant amendment. We've got 53 reforms in this package. Here's the problem with those reforms. We rely on the same people that abused the system to enforce those reforms. And they still don't go to the constitutional level that is required in this country. Who doesn't trust those 53 reforms? Congress doesn't trust those 53 reforms. The authors of this bill, you know how I know? Because they put an exemption, 2 exemptions for themselves in this bill. That's right. If the FBI is going to use 702 FISA to spy on congressmen, they have to tell Congress. They even have to get permission from the congressman they're spying on if they say it's for the congressman's own good. Why do we have a provision in there that exempts congressmen but not all of America? Americans deserve the protections that are enshrined in the Constitution. Nothing less should pass this House.
Pretty strong advocacy for that warrant amendment, which eventually did fail. What's your reaction?
I mean, look, Congressman Massey knows better than to say what he was saying. He claims that there's no need, that you have to have a warrant requirement. It's required by the Constitution, right? Every court to squarely consider the issue has said you don't need a warrant to search that database, right? Remember what we're talking about here. This is a database of lawfully collected information, collected under the Constitution and statutes, under the oversight of a court that grants authority every year to conduct the surveillance of foreigners located outside the United States. And the only question on the table is, do you need a warrant to go search for an American's identifier, their email address, their phone number in that database? And if you find it, can you read that email? Right? Can you listen to that phone call? Right? If you want to surveil that American, then you're like, okay, yes, they're talking to Osama bin Laden, right? This is a real problem. We need to find out what they're doing. You've got to go to court to get an order. The question is, can you read that Osama bin Laden email back and forth between those two people? And Congressman Massey says, well, it'll all be fine. If there's exigent circumstances, then you can look at it without the need. How would you know if there's exigent circumstances if all you do is search the database, say, oh, Jamil Jaffer is talking to Osama bin Laden, and that's all you know? You can't open the email. How do you know whether is he talking about the weather, his dry cleaning, or a terrorist attack? You don't know. Massey says, don't worry, exigent circumstances we'll all figure out. That's just not true. You would never know. You'd never be able to prove to a court. And then he says, well, you can just go get a warrant, right? Probable cause warrant. Where's the probable cause? All you know is that there's a communication. You don't know what it's about. You don't know if Jamil Jaffer is the fast food guy, right, or the terrorist. And so this idea that that's what you need, right? It's just not true. In fact, before 9/11, right, we had other provisions like this where we said, hey, if you're a law enforcement agent and you want to talk to an intelligence officer about surveillance, you got to go and get authority from the Attorney General. It's called the wall, right? The 9/11 Commission made clear that it was that wall or misperceptions about it that led to failures to share information that made it impossible for us to identify the fact that there were 2 al-Qaeda terrorists living in San Diego under their true names. You go to the 9/11 Museum, there's a San Diego phone book with Nawaf al-Hazmi, a 9/11 hijacker, living his true name. Those 2 hijackers were seen in Malaysia a few months earlier by the CIA, and they have a photograph of them. They knew they were terrorists. They didn't tell the FBI because there was confusion about this wall. let's not recreate a new wall. We have information in a lawfully connected database. Congressman Massey, by the way, alongside the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, alongside Jim Jordan. I mean, this is like literally people who never talk to one another making common cause, saying, no, what we really need here is a warrant. But the truth is, that is not what's required by the law. It's not required by the Constitution. Congress wants to do it. That's fine. But just know it will make it much harder for us to know when an American's talking to a terrorist and what they're talking about.
We'll take your calls and questions on this topic on FISA. Our line for Republicans is 202-748-8001, Democrats at 202-748-8000, and Independents at 202-748-8002. I want to ask you also about what exact type of information this is that's in this database, and can you give a bit more detail about who gets access to it and some of these potential abuses that the congressman referenced?
So, a lot of people want to know what is it you collect here. So what we're collecting here is phone calls, emails, other communications between these foreigners located overseas, right? These terrorists, these spies, and their compatriots overseas, as well as potentially if there are communications into and out of the U.S. We want to know that as well, because, of course, that's the time at which you really want to know. Is a person talking to a foreign spy in Russia? Are they talking to a terrorist in Afghanistan or the like? And you want to know that, and you want to be able to collect on that piece of information. As long as you're targeting that foreigner located overseas. If you're talking American, got to go get a court order. We're talking about at the last declassified number, about 200,000 to 300,000 people under coverage, right? That's, by the way, in a world of 8 billion people worldwide. 350 million Americans. We're talking about a tiny portion of the globe, all foreigners located overseas, being surveilled, right? In fact, of that entire database where Americans might be talking to these folks, only 3.2% goes to the FBI and is subject to these searches that Congressman Massey was talking about. So we're talking about a tiny set of targets of surveillance. You're talking about a very rare case when Americans are going to be talking to them, and then only 3% of that entire database going to the FBI that might be searched under these searches that Congressman Massey is concerned about. So it's a tiny problem we're talking about, right? And it's the kind of thing that do you really want to build that barrier and say, hey, you've got the information, lock it in a safe until you go get a judge to tell you you can have it, even though you got that information lawfully.
Noah Chauvin at NYU's Brennan Center for Justice talked about some of these, searches within this database, saying officials from the FBI, CIA, NSA, and the National Counterterrorism Center perform more than 200,000 warrantless backdoor searches every year to find and review Americans' private phone calls, text messages, and emails. Lax rules adopted by agencies allow intelligence officials to perform backdoor searches whenever they have reason to believe the query will return foreign intelligence or, for the FBI, evidence of a crime. Given FISA's capacious definition of foreign intelligence, this low bar should be easy to clear, but officials have repeatedly stumbled over it. Government reports indicate that in 2022, the FBI performed close to 4,000 backdoor searches that violated even its own permissive rules. In another recent one-year period, the FBI violated the rules governing searches of FISA databases 278,000 times. That sounds like a lot.
Well, here's what I think is interesting about this. First of all, we use terms like backdoor. There's nothing backdoor about this. When the law was passed in 2007, and every time it's been reauthorized, the 3 or 4 times it's been reauthorized since then, we've had this exact debate. Congress has known about it. Congress understands that you're collecting on information about foreigners located overseas. They sometimes talk to Americans, just like when you're surveilling a mafioso. Sometimes he talks to his wife. Sometimes he talks to the dry cleaner. Sometimes he talks to the pizza place. And sometimes that pizza place, that wife, or that dry cleaner is actually the mafioso's associate, and they're talking about bad stuff. And that's how you figure it out, right? And we're talking about spies and terrorists. They're using codes. They're using foreign languages. You need to collect that information and look at it. And the idea that we would just lock it away because they're having to talk to an American email address or American phone number, that's exactly when you need to have it, right? So it's not a backdoor search. It's a front door search. Everyone knows it's happening. The reason it's warrantless is you can't get a warrant on a foreigner located overseas. They don't have any rights under the Constitution. And of course, you're going to look at it and try to figure out, is this person another compatriot who's trying to conduct an attack in the homeland, or are they just somebody they happen to be emailing? So please.
Well, what kind of safeguards are there for American citizens under this system?
So there are very few people at the FBI. First of all, they only get 3.2% of this entire collection. So it's a tiny portion that we're talking about searching. Second, there are only a handful of people under 20 that are authorized to actually approve those queries. Now, Jonathan correctly talks about, there have been a lot of errors, a lot of mistakes, right? There have been X thousand searches, right, that have been conducted. How do we know that? Because the FBI found out they made a mistake, they self-reported to the courts, and the courts told Congress. Right? So we know all this. These aren't, I decided to go in intentionally and go find an American and threaten them, right? The rare cases where that happens, those people will go to jail, they're prosecuted, they lose security clearances. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about mistakes that were made. In fact, there was one example, what the FBI had done, and so I laugh, this is a serious matter because we're talking about Americans' privacy and civil liberties. But the kind of mistakes they made was they had a thing where you would check a box to search the databases you're authorized to, and it did, the automatic thing was select all. So it selected all the databases instead of saying pick the ones you want. And so those 298,000 or whatever that number was, that's because they did, the men and women who were doing queries hit the select all button instead of the pick your 3 databases. Now, that's not good because it is a violation, right? But how do we find out about it? They found out, they're like, we made this mistake. And there were all these queries being done by analysts who didn't know better. They trained them better now. The laws are now in place to make clear that you have to report that. They did report it, and it's been fixed. And so the idea there's sort of a massive intentional violation of American civil liberties, warrantless surveillance and backdoor searches, just not true. I love the buzzwords. Let's be real.
All right, let's go to some calls. James is in Atlanta on our line for Independence. Good morning, James.
Yes, I have two issues I'd like to bring up with you real quick. The first issue is you were on TV talking when you was in the Bush administration, you was part of the policymakers when they was doing warrantless wiretapping on American citizens. Number one, you are part of the policy that was you were part of the person that came up doing this policy. Now you are on TV talking about you had nothing to do with it. And the next issue is this. What Joe Biden and the Jewish Americans are doing, Anthony Blinken, who are conspiring with, they are losing their own election. They're putting the tail is wagging the dog. Israel
So
has
why
never...
don't you just respond to that first part?
Sure. Well, look, I did serve in the Bush administration. I served at the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, which is the part of the Justice Department that's responsible for obtaining these court orders. So the caller's exactly right. I was involved in exactly those processes. But truth be told, the Bush administration did run a program between 2001 and 2007 where they collected intelligence in the United States without warrants. But again, focused on foreigners located overseas primarily. And that was the time before we got this law. The reason we went and got this law was because the Bush administration decided to shut that program down, to go to the FISA court, get authority. The FISA court, it got a little challenging. There was one judge that approved the orders that we needed to get the flexibility. Then the next judge was like, well, I want a little more information. It slowed the process down. So ultimately, we went to Congress. I was there when we went to Congress in 2007 to get this authority. And that's why these aren't sort of unauthorized searches. These are searches authorized by Congress in statute, right? We went and got a law. Congress said, yep, you can do these without a warrant. You go get a court order for a year, and you can put whatever email addresses and phone numbers on as long as they're foreigners located outside the United States. Because, again, they don't have a right to a warrant. There's no way to get a warrant for surveilling foreigners located overseas. And then the only question we're talking about, to the caller's point, is what do you do if you want to look in that database that you now have, 3.2% of that database, right? And say, okay, is an American talking to a terrorist or a spy? And if so, what are they saying? And then you can go to court with that information. Say, hey, judge, look, Jamil's talking to Osama bin Laden. Can we get a court order for him? Because you have to get a court order for him or her if they're talking to a person. You want to collect their information by targeting them.
We have a question we received via text message. Dan in Pennsylvania asks, how does dual citizenship complicate surveillance law?
That's a great question that Dan has. And the answer is, if you're a dual citizen, that is a U.S. citizen and some other citizen of another country, you get the protections allowable for U.S. citizens. And in fact, it's not just U.S. citizens that get that protection. It's also U.S. green card holders. So if you're a green card holder, a U.S. permanent resident, or a U.S. citizen, no matter where you are in the world, you get the right to a court order from the FISA court or a Title III traditional warrant from a federal judge outside the FISA court before you can be surveilled. And by the way, that's a protection that's in Section 702. If Section 702 expires, that protection for Americans overseas, gone.
We have Steve in Tampa, Florida, who asks, what restrictions are in place to prevent subversion of the coming election? Green and Company say they, I'm guessing that's a reference to Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Company say they plan to obstruct normal electoral college votes, hold all traitors accountable.
Look, the FISA law doesn't allow the Section 702 doesn't allow surveillance in the United States. So we're not going to be talking about sort of what happens in the U.S. on elections with that. To the extent that foreigners looking overseas, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, all of which, by the way, we know, in particular China and Russia, have sought to influence our elections 2016, 2020, and we know they plan to do it in 2024. We might get that information. This authority goes away. It's going to be very hard to know what are the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians doing to try to attempt to undermine our elections. They've been doing it for years. Their goal actually is to create dissension in America. Their goal is to undermine our law enforcement, our intelligence agencies, to make them be viewed as corrupt and incapable here in the United States. It is that corrosive effect that the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians want to have inside our democracy. And by the way, it's working. These kind of votes you see, the idea that we need a warrant for this database, that is informed by misinformation, disinformation about the way our system works and undermining in confidence in the FBI and our law enforcement agencies that is leading us here. We are giving in to the very kind of pressure that your caller, your messenger there is talking about.
Roberto is in Houston on our line for independence. Go ahead, Roberto.
Yes, thank you for having this gentleman on. This addresses my concern. I've given this question over to 4 representatives for next week's discussion, and so I really would like your opinion on this. Here's the question. How would the American Jonathan Pollard spy case involving a foreign government, Israel, during the Reagan administration have been prevented if FISA had been in effect, or is this type of case not addressed? And you mentioned it came up, the dual citizenship. Perhaps Jonathan Pollard had dual citizenship. But also, I never found out how was Pollard finally caught. And by the way, when he served some prison time, not the entire term, when he was released, he went straight to Israel, and they gave him a hero's welcome. So this is something we need to remember.
So let's
perhaps.
let
Thank you.
respond to the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the Jonathan Pollard case is an interesting one. This was an American who had access to classified information, who shared it with Israel, information about nuclear secrets. He went to jail for a long, long time, and then ultimately was repatriated to Israel based on his age and his sort of infirmities. The Pollard case is a real problem because you wouldn't be able to surveil Jonathan Pollard in the United States. He's an American in the U.S. using Section 702, right? That's where you need to go. Get a FISA court order, get authority from a federal judge, and then obtain his information. The caller asked how Pollard was caught. I don't know. I don't know if we were surveilling Israel and we caught the information, or we had a human source inside of Israel that told us, or he made a mistake or got caught here. I'm actually not sure. I don't remember. I've read the story of Pollard. I just don't recall off the top of my head.
Either.
Yeah. But what I will say is, once we were on to Pollard, one of the most important tools we probably had, I don't know for sure, but I bet money that we did surveil Jonathan Pollard with a judge's oversight, with a traditional Title I FISA court order, not Section 702, and that we probably knew a lot about what he was doing and saying in the U.S. while we were working up the case to go after him. And I bet you that information was probably pretty important to the case against Jonathan Pollard and ultimately why he went to jail for many, many, many years.
Jim is in Fairmount, Minnesota on our line for independence. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, I'd kind of like to know where Jamal stands on.
Jamil.
I would like to know where he stands on the 702 as it relates to the GOP passing the metadata collection a few years ago. That is spying on Americans itself. I'll listen and see what he has to say.
Yeah. No, thanks to Jim. So what Jim is talking about, this metadata collection program, right? This was, we learned about this after the Snowden leaks, right? And we learned that what the U.S. government had been doing for many years, this was another program that admittedly I was involved in back from 2007 on. We were collecting virtually all, from a variety of carriers, virtually all of the phone calls back and forth in the United States and abroad, with the phone numbers, right? So the dialed number from to the length, time, and duration of the call. So who are these people all calling, right? Who are they emailing, right? Email address to, from, date, and time of the email, right? So this information is all being collected, and you were able to identify networks of who was talking to who, right? The reason this was controversial after Edward Snowden revealed it was because it wasn't just foreigners located overseas. It was all the phone calls and emails in the United States that were being carried by these providers. And so that's a lot of data. And to your caller's point, to Jim's point, a lot of data about Americans. Now, no content. No, what does the email say? None of that. Just the dialed number or the email address to and from and the date, time, and duration of those communications. But still very, very important. It was an early warning system in our minds. And when the government obtained that authority, Congress was briefed on it many, many times. Every member of the House, I remember being in the House of Representatives when we reauthorized this program. Every member of the House had the opportunity to come down to the House Intelligence Committee to be briefed. I briefed people individually myself on the program, explained how wide scale it was, what it collected, and why it was so important, why we thought it was that important early warning fence. Ultimately, Congress decided to reauthorize it with some significant restrictions in the aftermath of the Snowden debates and disclosures. And then ultimately, the government decided to stop collecting in that manner, right, and stop using that program and using that authority because the new laws made it difficult to do what they needed to do. And ultimately, that program, as it stood back in that era, doesn't run anymore. But an important debate that we had, and one that even when I learned about that program back in 2007, was concerning to me. I said, look, this is. I believe we need to do these things. At the same time, we're going to need to explain to the American people why we're collecting all this information about their phone calls. Not the content, but why we're collecting this information and how we were protecting it. There were a lot of protections in place. Ultimately, Congress decided to put more in place, and the program no longer exists the way it did back then.
Jim, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes. With the collection as it's done presently, and with the former administration freely using that stuff, apparently the voter, with the voter sharing, voter information being shared in the 16, I believe it was the 16 campaign. Where do you stand on that? Are you okay with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, this is a great question. So as far as I'm aware, none of that metadata information or the like was used for anything other than national security purposes. But Jim raises, I think, a different and important point, which is that voter information is very widely available. So the information about where you and I are registered to vote, right? How often we vote, whether we take a Republican or Democrat ballot, if that's in your state, that's relevant, right? All that information is in databases held by each individual state, and it's freely available. You can walk down to the local voting records office, ask for it, and get a list. Oftentimes it's a paper list. You can ask
Sometimes
for it.
It's online.
You can get it online. You get a database, right? You get a CSV file. And this is actually how, if you wonder why, how do people know to mail me ballots or information about Republicans or Democrats? How do they know to knock on my door? I've done that knocking on doors, by the way, myself. You actually have an app on your phone that just takes the voter database, puts it right at your fingertips. You know, okay, this is John Smith. He's a registered Republican. Jane Smith, his wife, is a registered Democrat. There's their age, and they voted in the last 3 primaries. That information is all available. It has nothing to do with surveillance. It has nothing to do with government authorities. It's just available to the average voter. You can go in and you get it yourself, and these campaigns buy it at scale. And so you might say, well, I don't like that being out there. That's a different matter, and each state handles it differently.
Dan is in Rochester, New York, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I basically have 2 questions. I'd like to know if Justice Judge Roberts oversees the FISA court, or who oversees the FISA court. And the other question is about the Steele dossier. Have any repercussions happened after, finding out the falsities involved?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the FISA court, the judges on the FISA court, they're actually just regular federal district court judges from around the country. They get appointed to the FISA court, to your caller's point, by the Chief Justice of the United States. They get appointed to a set number of years to be on that court. And so what they do is they do their normal job out in the district courts they serve in around the country. And then once a month or 2, they come to D.C., spend a week here, and serve on the FISA court in that role. All the while, by the way, still doing their job back home in their district court. So they're sort of doing double duty. So these are regular federal judges. And they're appointed by the Chief Justice. And they're overseen there's a FISA appellate court, also appointed by the Chief Justice, and then ultimately the Supreme Court has review authority over those decisions. In addition, all the decisions by the FISA court and the like obviously are reviewed by the government and by any other parties that are come before the court. And then Congress is able to get copies of those decisions and information about what the FISA court is doing. And so committees like the House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, and Senate Judiciary Committee all get the ability to read these decisions, understand what the courts are doing, and then bring in the court or the Justice Department or the other various agencies for oversight. We used to do that all the time at the House Intelligence Committee. And the new bill, the Section 702 bill that was passed by the House, has even more reforms to create more transparency, more opportunities for other advocates to get before the FISA court and the like. But again, these are regular federal judges who are overseen and appointed by the Chief Justice and then overseen by the appellate courts and ultimately the Supreme Court.
And what about his question on the Steele dossier?
Yeah, the Steele dossier, hard to know what's going on with that right now. Obviously, I think it's a lot of its validity has been undermined. I think everyone understands sort of what it was now. I think the most interesting question in the FISA context, where the Steele dossier played something of a role, was the surveillance of Carter Page, who was thought to be somebody who was potentially working for the Russians, an American. The government went to the FISA court, got a traditional FISA court order. It was not Section 702 surveillance, even though President Trump seems to be confused about that, was confused back during his time in office, confused again this past week writing tweets on Truth Social. Carter Page was
specifically, he said, kill FISA. It was illegally used against me and many others. They spied on my campaign, is what he said on Truth Social.
So President Trump just dead wrong about that. He, by the way, put out a similar tweet on Twitter or X, whatever, back in the day when he was in office. His White House was seeking to reauthorize the law. He tweeted something similar in the lead up to the House vote. The White House had to walk that back, tell the president, you're just wrong about this. And he's back at it again a few years later. Same mistake, same error, two different authorities, not correct. But the president's right to be concerned about one thing, which is this Carter Page surveillance that took place and relates to the Steele dossier. There was a lawyer who had found out, asked the government on a reauthorization of the authority to surveil Carter Page, hey, is he working for us? And he was told, yes, he's actually working for the CIA. The lawyer did not put that, in fact, put the opposite in the renewal. That lawyer has since been prosecuted. He was fired from the Justice Department. Frankly, I think he should have gone to jail. He didn't go to jail. He got probation. I think he should have gone to jail because that is exactly the kind of thing that undermines confidence in the system. That's the kind of intentional violation. Almost never happens. When it does happen, you got to throw the book at these people. He did get fired, did get prosecuted. It's a huge problem. But, by the way, if President Trump is saying kill FISA, let's say he means kill Section 702. Well, what that would mean is we're not going to get surveillance of foreigners located overseas, terrorists and spies. Clearly, he doesn't want that. If he does, that's crazy and wrong. But if he means kill traditional FISA, the thing that was used to surveil Carter Page, I mean, that would get rid of all the protections that we put in place for Americans. So in any event, President Trump just confused about the authority. Second, wrong on the merits on this one. No question about it. And I think actually people around him have come to him and explained. That's why after that one tweet earlier this week, he pretty much went dead silent. You didn't see, the normal Trump mode is let's put out tons of tweets, particularly as this vote was going on. He would have been tweeting totally quiet because somebody came to him and told him, hey, you're being misled. You're being given bad information. You're not right about this. And he quieted down.
A couple more pieces of reaction from X. Michael Thornton said, in response to your question of, do you really want to build that barrier between the departments and the story you told about 9/11? Michael Thornton says, you mean complying with the Constitution? Yes. Go ahead.
So to be clear, that wall that we created and the gates in that wall back before 9/11, not required by the Constitution. Every court to have looked at it, including the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the Foreign Intelligence Court of Review, and various federal courts have said there is no requirement to create a barrier between the lawfully collected information being shared between law enforcement agencies and the intelligence community. If you want to create that barrier, you can, right? Congress can do it if they want to, not required by the Constitution. Same thing here. Section 702, lawfully collected information against foreigners located outside the states who have no constitutional rights under our Constitution, have no right to a warrant, right? Lawfully collected under statute. You want to put a barrier and say, nope, you got to go get a judge and get a warrant. We can do that. We do things like that all the time to protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties, but that's a choice, not a requirement of the Constitution. So let's be clear, it's not required. Every court to have decided the question has held that it is not required. There is one court, I should note, there's one court that suggested in certain circumstances there may be a need for a warrant, suggested, not held. Every court to actually have looked at the question squarely has said, nope, no constitutional requirement.
Bill in Connecticut sent us a text message asking how many people are engaged in any way with the various security systems employed by the U.S. government agencies, including the military. And I'm guessing as it pertains to FISA.
If we're talking about outside of FISA, right? I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people that have security clearances, top secret SCI security clearances, so lots. With respect to FISA, it's a much smaller number, right? It's FBI agents who are doing surveillance and conducting investigations in these cases, and there's probably tens of thousands of those total writ large across the government. Authorized to approve searches like this, well under 100, probably 10 or 15 at every agency. And in fact, this bill puts even more restrictions, this bill that the House passed this week, even more restrictions on who can do it and how senior you need to be to approve a query into the database for an American, to 3.2% of the overall database that's being collected. So approvals, very small numbers. Actual ability to look at it after it's been approved and collected, probably a higher number. People with security clearances is a much, much larger number. So it depends on what we're talking about. But look, these are the people that defend our nation, that protect us against terrorists, protect us against spies, identify that information. Then it's our members of the military intelligence service who are overseas, serving overseas, protecting this country every day, and actually knocking down these missiles that we're launching at our allies as well.
David is in Texas on our line for Independence. Go ahead, David.
Yes, sir, you got asked about the Steele dossier, and you seemed to skirted it and talked about the FISA court. What about the credibility and the intelligence work on the Steele dossier? Wasn't it pretty much proven to be fallacious?
Yeah, I think today the Steele dossier has lost credibility altogether. And the reason I was sort of stumbling there a little bit was because I didn't expect to get a Steele dossier question, didn't prepare for it, right? I haven't frankly thought about the Steele dossier in such a long time because it feels sort of like, last election cycle and the election cycle before that's news. And so just wasn't up to speed on it. But look, the Steele dossier, I think, has lost all credibility. It doesn't mean that what was in there might have been right or wrong. We don't know. But the dossier itself and all the material, the way it was collected and the like, I don't think anybody thinks that that's got real credibility to it today.
Jack is in Georgia on our line for Democrats. Go ahead, Jack.
Hello, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Okay, I have a big idea. You might think it's all crazy, but, our problem was with the Attorney General being appointed by the president. I think it was, what was they called, a Saturday night massacre back during Watergate, when I think they tried to get rid of the Attorney General. And then the same thing happened with Donald Trump, Attorney General. What about an idea that the Supreme Court appoints the Attorney General and then is confirmed by Congress, by the Senate, the usual way, and so that removes the president? It always seems like the Attorney General, they're supposed to be independent, they're supposed to be independent, they're supposed to be independent. If Trump gets back in, it's going to be, again, the same thing where he's going to have the Attorney General be loyal to him like he tried to do the first time. So I know this is hard, big idea, but, you folks over there who are in the Senate could start talking about a change to the way we do things where the Supreme Court appoints the Attorney General, makes us much more independent from the executive branch. It's all Justice Department problems that they're dependent on the president. Thanks.
Well, look, I like big ideas. I mean, this country is founded on big ideas. The idea of equal rights and the idea of freedom, the idea of freedom of speech, the idea of freedom of religion, right? These are big ideas, and so I don't have a problem with big ideas. Here's I think, the practical challenges to what the caller describes. If, in fact, you would have the Supreme Court appoint the Attorney General and they were subject to confirmation by Congress and the like, that will require fundamentally a constitutional amendment, right? We've had efforts to try and have independent prosecutors, right? In fact, there was an entire statute passed by Congress called the Independent Counsel Statute, where the Attorney General would appoint an independent counsel. They would not report to the AG or report to the president. They'd operate on their own. And ultimately, there were legal issues. The Supreme Court was questioning whether that was constitutional. Ultimately, Congress decided to let that statute expire. It hasn't been put back in place. But you probably couldn't do it by law. You'd have to do it by a constitutional amendment that would require either a constitutional convention or passage by the several states and ratification. Well, passage by Congress, ratification by the several states through the constitutional procedure. But again, big ideas matter, and we have had, over nearly 2 dozen constitutional amendments. So you could have another one, right? Not impossible, but would be, I think, a big lift to change the law in that way. But if we think that's important, right, there's a process for starting that process, and the states can consider it and move out on it if that makes sense.
That's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you so much, Jamil Jaffer, who is the founder of the National Security Institute at the George Mason University School of Law. Really appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks, Kim.